When you think of classic RPGs, your mind goes to games like Final Fantasy, Pokemon, and Dragon Quest, Tales of Destiny, Chrono Trigger, and maybe Shin Megami Tensei, Square Enix, Nintendo, and Atlas, the big boys. But how many of you think of Sega? Yeah, not a lot if I were to guess, and for those of you who do, it's probably for something like this. And that's not what we're talking about today. Sega not being one of the immediate thoughts when thinking of RPGs is a shame because their history with the genre and their approach to how they're designed is fascinating, starting all the way back in 1987 and later overseas in 1988 when they released Phantasy Star on the Master System. A game that I really want to talk about with you all. I've had my eye on this series for a while now as they've been featured in many Sega collections I've had in the past. Granted, they didn't click with me at the time, but as I got older I've wanted to come back to them after gaining a newfound interest when peering into the series from the outside. This quadrilogy tells a cohesive story, so there's a set narrative that's stuck with its ending all these years later, and from what fans say, it's one that's well told across all 4 entries. That sounds super cool, and it's safe to assume they stuck the landing since Phantasy Star 4 is revered as one of the greatest RPGs of the time. I want to know how it all plays out, especially because the genre for this series is a hybrid between fantasy and sci-fi. And it's a space adventure? Yes please. Now some of you may be asking how Phantasy Star came to be, right? Well, we're all aware of how competitive Sega used to be, and probably still are. After all, Sonic was made almost entirely to go toe-to-toe with Mario. Phantasy Star has a similar origin story, meant to be the company's answer to Dragon Quest, which was a huge success and a big reason as to why JRPGs became so popular in the gaming scene. It's no exaggeration to call that game the Super Mario Brothers of JRPGs, and thus Sega had to challenge this titan as well to capitalize on its success, maybe even surpassing it while they were at it. Whether that was accomplished or not, that's up to personal preference. This game was a hit, garnering praise for its scope, pushing the 8-bit console's graphics to their limit, and providing such a different experience to JRPG fans as a whole. It was an exceptionally impressive game for the time, but that's the thing, the time was back in the 80s. It is now 2022 and I'm playing this as someone who doesn't really experience all too many classic RPGs in his free time, let alone turn-based games, since I'd rather play any other RPG subgenre before them. I don't hate old games or whatever, but their cryptic instructions on where to go in order to progress and random encounters always gives me more trouble than I feel is worth. I did want to play through this game for curiosity's sake, however, and I figured the few quality of life improvements in the Sega Ages Switch port would help a bit, but I wasn't expecting much. Honestly, the plan was to simply switch over to a fan translation of the PS2 remake after giving this version some time, and experience the original game story that way, while hopefully having a cleaner, more newcomer-friendly time. So you can only imagine my surprise when by the end of this Phantasy Star 1 experiment journey thingy, I not only finished both the PS2 remake and the original, but I haven't stopped thinking about them since. This game, or these games I guess I should say, have been on my mind a lot lately, not because I didn't enjoy them or anything, but for the opposite reason. I like these games. I like these games a lot. And when trying to put my thoughts together, it wasn't making any sense. Do these games fall into a lot of the pitfalls I feel plague older RPGs? Yes, very much so. Random encounters still suck in this game, and there were so many instances where I had no clue where to go. Not to mention the story isn't all that developed or much of anything in many instances, especially in the classic version. I wasn't big on the music, and while many of the graphical tricks seen in the original were no doubt a sight to behold back in the day, they don't look all that great now, and all of this isn't even going into the gameplay problems I have, especially with the combat system for both versions. But for whatever reason, the negatives didn't stick in my mind nearly as much as the positives, and we're hopefully gonna get to the bottom of all that. I'm attempting to make sense of retro appeal, if you will, and that may require you to open your mind and suspend your disbelief a bit, so bear with me, grab yourself a snack, some water while you're at it, and hop into the spaceship, loser, because this is my revolutionary review for Phantasy Star. Again, if it wasn't already clear, this video is taking a look at both the original version as well as the PS2 remake. Starting with the former, I'm specifically looking at the Switch port released through the Sega Ages line. This is a group of classic Sega re-releases by M2, including titles such as Alex Kidd in Miracle World, Shinobi, and Phantasy Star! Oh my god! While you can play the game as it was originally intended, I opted to play this game through the newly added Ages mode, where the experience and money you gain at the end of battles is multiplied in order to lessen the amount of grinding required. And alongside a lower encounter rate in order to balance out the battle rewards multiplier, and a faster walk speed to make the game more, fun, these quality of life improvements serve to alleviate slower moments and potential tedium, while keeping the rest of the game untouched so the core experience is able to be enjoyed as originally designed. I swear that I never grinded more than necessary or abused any of these added conveniences. Trust me. That sounds sarcastic, but I am serious. The PS2 remake, on the other hand, was played completely straight, of course, only having an English translation patch modded in that I got off of the Phantasy Star Cave. Link in the description. This was a Japan exclusive released under the Sega Ages 2500 series, a lineup of remakes made on a budget priced lower than retail titles of the time, with this being the first of the bunch. To be perfectly honest, this version of the game isn't too well loved by the fandom as a result of that budget, with many citing this being not as good a remake as the game deserved. How do I feel about the matter? We'll hopefully be answering that question over the course of the video, so what do you say we start off with the first thing people tend to discuss when comparing a remake to its original, the updated presentation. Starting with classic Phantasy Star, it doesn't look too shabby, and that's coming from someone who generally doesn't care for 8-bit sprite work. While overworld character sprites are hilariously simple, enemies and battle screens more than make up for them with their detailed looks that feel like they should come from a higher bit console than the Master System. I'd easily call this the best looking title for it. The same kind of detail goes for when the game tosses in the rare cutscene, giving every party member a portrait to communicate with one another. Their character designs are pretty standard for the most part, but Alice sticks out if anyone. Alice, Alyssa, that's another thing about this game we've got to go over real quick, isn't it? This is the protagonist in this game. In Japan, her name is Alyssa. Everywhere else, she goes by Alice. Why? I don't know, why not? Playing both versions back to back with the PS2 version using the Japanese names and the Ages version the localized ones, I tend to flip-flop on how I refer to this cast. However, after asking you all on Twitter, most of you know this girl as Alice, with the rest of the main characters mainly being known by their localized names as well, so that's what I'll refer to them as throughout this video. Cool? Cool. Moving along to the PS2 version, it goes for a hand-drawn style, and while many cite these visuals as cheap and not as good as they could have been, which I somewhat agree with, I do still find them appealing. The overworld sprites do the designs far more justice this time around than before. Monsters still look great, and in battle, rather than a first-person POV, you get a third-person perspective, so you can actually see characters do their commands and whatnot. I tend to prefer this for whatever reason, so this was an upgrade in my book. And speaking of upgrades, the cutscenes. There are not only more of them, but they look so much better. They're all uniquely illustrated to allow for a full range of emotions and expressions, helping to characterize these characters far more than the original game ever could. And thank God they look so nice because you can't skip them. I said it before, I'll say it again. Unskippable cutscenes should be illegal. Pretty sure cruel and unusual punishment isn't allowed in this country, so I don't know what the deal is. Overall, I'd call the PS2 version a step up from the original for sure if we're strictly referring to the ways the games present themselves on a visual level. Again, I will admit that this game could have taken the whole hand-drawn approach a lot farther, and this is one of the biggest showcases of the game's limited budget, but it still looks good for what it's worth. Can't really say the same about the soundtrack though, for both versions of the game. The original's OST is fine, I guess, but super short, and the list of songs I genuinely like is even shorter. I do love the overall theme for Palma though. Phantasy Star PS2 updates the soundtrack and even adds a few new tracks, and somehow it's still worse. Seriously, just compare my favorite song of the original OST to its new rendition. What the heck happened here? It sounds like I'm playing some kind of freeware flash game. There are like 2 tracks here that actually sound better than the originals, but that's pretty much it. I for sure prefer the original OST, but even then, I can't say I'm a fan. As you've probably noticed by now, I'll use some of the game's music and official remixes here and there, but for the most part, I'll be using outside music for the video with all the credit and links to listen to them in the description as always. Going back to the aspect of the presentation I actually enjoy, most of this game's visual prowess is a direct result of the genius art direction with the fantasy sci-fi blend, as it works exceptionally well, much better than I could have ever anticipated. It doesn't even really feel like a hybrid due to how natural everything works together. Like, yeah, Alice is rocking a traditional piece of armor while chopping down dragons with a lightsaber. What about it? Odin can equip an axe for some big boy hits, but can I interest you in this multi-targeting laser gun with fixed damage? One minute you're fighting Medusa, the next you're taking a spaceport to a nearby planet in the Algol solar system. It's all played straight and even more surprisingly, just works. I love it, and I love all of the great monster designs and unique locations that stem from this combo. The Algol solar system consists of 3 planets: Palma, the green one, Lotavia, the desert one, and Azores, the ice one. A bit by the numbers, but cool nevertheless. One of those taking that quite literally. These planets all house their own overworlds, which in hindsight aren't too big on their own, but combine to make a pretty decent map size, and splitting the world into 3 large sections defined by being their own separate worlds gives this adventure a scope that was unmatched by anything else on the market at the time. Even now it's pretty cool, despite recognizing the fact that the combined size of these maps isn't all that large, it just feels large, you know? The sense of scale is maintained, a feeling that was kept throughout the entirety of the story as a matter of fact. One that takes place, again, in the Algol solar system under the rule of an evil tyrant named King Lasik. Lasik, I don't know, I'm calling him Lasik. Many have tried to rise up and overthrow him, but none have succeeded, ending the lives of many by his hand, including our protagonist's brother, Nero. In fact, that's exactly where we pick up upon starting a new game. Alice discovering that her brother has been killed. Swearing to get revenge for him, she sets off to find a warrior her brother told her about, all on a quest to defeat the evil tyrant, and that's it. Go kill the evil king. As older games did, you could get a lot more background and setup if you went out of your way to read the manual, which after doing just that, helped a lot of the endgame plot points actually make sense, but whether you take that extra initiative to get all the details possible or not, the premise remains more or less the same. Your brother died by the hands of a king mad with power, he gotta go. And that simplicity is carried throughout the entire game. Your goal never changes, and no crazy plot twists ever happen until the very end, which I thought I wouldn't be fond of, but against all odds, this ended up working for me. Right off the bat, I appreciate that the game acknowledges this story as one that isn't all that complicated and keeps story-heavy scenes to a minimum, teetering the ratio of story to gameplay more in the direction I care about the most. And this minimalist storytelling ended up leaving a lot of the more minuscule details up to my imagination. What was the relationship between Alice and Odin? How well does Lutz feel like he fits in? Is Meow a snarky bastard 24/7? It's all up to me, and since these 4 party members are the only ones the whole way through, this mindset was reached at all because I grew attached to them thanks to my time spent with them, thanks to how many battles we fought and won. I was able to forge a connection with them all, not because the game told me how to feel about each one, but because it gave the player enough respect and breathing room to come to their own conclusions. You can call it laziness, but it came across more as an intentional decision around then current limitations. So with this in mind, I really like this party, even more so in the PS2 version where more dialogue was added to allow for more concrete relationships and personality, while still leaving the majority of the gaps to be filled by the player. It's updating a classic experience while still leaving its original mentality intact. No doubt and thanks to most of the added dialogue being optional and primarily to help guide the player where to go next to progress the story when it's unclear, which unfortunately does tend to happen a fair amount. There were many times where I was forced to use a guide and map to tell me the names of locations, where I was supposed to go and how I was supposed to get there after trying on my own a bunch because the game doesn't make that all too clear. Even on the PS2 version, there were still some instances where a guide felt necessary, but to be perfectly fair, I believe the game expected everyone to play it with a manual of some kind that came with the game's original release. Yeah, remember these? Instruction manuals. And they're physical too? Oh my god. They've unfortunately become a lost art these days, but especially back on old school RPGs, they truly were a resource the games expected you to use in order to, instruct you on how to play the game, and in many instances, help guide you on certain story beats. And thankfully the Ages version of this game has a digital manual in order to do just that. Although it's not as in-depth as the original game's manual was, sadly. That thing even had a partial map of the overworld, which is weird since it's not the whole thing, but it's better than nothing. This should help you get through some parts of the game anyway, and if not, I don't think there's any shame here if you feel the need to look stuff up. I didn't really mind having to do that here since the journey still felt satisfying to go through. I'll remember what to do in future playthroughs, and I'll want to do future playthroughs because the game was designed in a way to where I don't have to follow this same order of events each time. I didn't expect this going into the game, but Phantasy Star is incredibly non-linear and purposefully designed so that you can go about the game's set pieces toward defeating Lasik in any order you desire. This was no accident either, as the original manual highlights and encourages the fact that there is no one golden path to the finish line. So combined with a simple story and lack of direction, along with the ability to hop between the 3 planets pretty damn early on, the game almost comes off as an open world type of deal. Do you clean up everything on Palma first, or do you perhaps want to head to Motavia? I can fight Medusa right now, but I can also hop over to Dazorus and grab some stronger weapons real quick before doing that. The game doesn't tell the player what to do next because that in and of itself is up to the player. Granted, a map of any kind would have been appreciated, but exploring the game and allowing yourself to get lost and stumble upon major events is a part of the charm and experience you forge for yourself. It's still fine to use a guide in order to have some kind of, guidance, but don't be afraid to loosen the leash, especially with this game's short runtime. I only took 9 hours to beat Classic Phantasy Star, with a fair amount of that time being spent wandering. This is a replayable RPG designed to be done differently each time, and I applaud that. Kind of a bummer that the PS2 version didn't get the memo though. This version is a lot less lenient on going about the game in a variety of ways, not necessarily due to railroading the player or any kind of story walls, but as a result of failing to balance enemies around the same level. In classic Phantasy Star, the monsters you fought on Palma would be around the same level as monsters on Motavia, with every planet having tougher enemies the deeper you got in, but still being able to reasonably defeat. Phantasy Star PS2, on the other hand, has enemies in certain areas you clearly aren't expected to be able to defeat at certain points, preventing you from doing specific events out of order. This is a bit of a bummer because the non-linearity ended up being one of my favorite parts about Phantasy Star. Why get rid of that? Actually, a part of me wants to say that this was unintentional, since enemy levels aside, you still technically have the ability to go about events the same ways as you could in the original, but there's just too much room for level differences this time around. The numbers across the board in terms of stats with your party members and the game's opponents are much higher than they were in the original, with the range being much larger as a result. I beat the original game at level 24, but I beat the PS2 version at level 70, meaning that while you could argue that the original game had some higher level enemies in specific areas, the level range wasn't nearly as wide there as it is in this remake. So I didn't ever notice too big a power difference in my entire playthrough. That, combined with the PS2 version taking me around 16 hours to complete as opposed to the original's 9, on top of the extra cutscenes being unskippable, makes this remake a far less replayable version. Which again, is kind of a bummer, but hey, that sort of thing might not even matter to you, and it doesn't by any means ruin the game for me. It just takes away more from my point of this story allowing you to forge your own experiences, you feel me? When reminiscing on this game, I thought back on a lot of iconic stretches like the tower to fight Medusa and get back at her for Odin, the gauntlet of caves on Dazorus leading to a village that felt like a safe haven, barely clawing my way through the penultimate boss having Alice being my sole survivor. These parts of the game hit harder than usual because I felt in complete control of everything happening when they happened. These weren't cutscenes or moments spoon-fed to me, but a self-created story that was mine and mine alone, making for a more personal experience than it would have been otherwise. And it's really cool to see such a big aspect of the gameplay heighten the overall experience. And while I feel like this was also the intention for the game's dungeons, I wasn't big on these no matter which version I played or how I approached them. They both feature first-person labyrinths that must have been mind-blowing back when the Master System was new anyway, having this pseudo 3D look as a result of some technical wizardry, but they just look kinda bad nowadays. The PS2 version isn't impressive in the slightest either, being fully rendered in proper 3D this time around, but just remaining uninteresting to look at. Phantasy Star PS2 has a somewhat dull color palette if I'm being honest, but here is where it's at its worst. Visuals aren't even the worst part though. I wasn't kidding when I called these labyrinths. Every dungeon is a maze, with them getting more floors, traps, and higher levels of complexity the further along you get. They eventually reach a point where they're simply unfun to traverse through it, with random encounters along the way and my absolute favorite feature of any RPG, the problems and annoyances are heightened. Because these dungeons are mazes, their layouts can become frustrating to learn, but thankfully both versions of the games that I played have means to alleviate this. Phantasy Star PS2 has an item you can buy called the Atlas that gives you a corner map for whatever dungeon you're in, allowing you to make a map and use it to find your way through or explore new areas. I like this a lot, but wish there was a way or some kind of stronger item to have this on permanently, as it disappears after so many steps. A lot of my inventory space was taken up by these, but with this game's forgiving amount of inventory slots, this didn't frustrate me as much as it could have. The original version of the game doesn't have such an item, but the Ages version, however, has another great quality of life addition where you can just activate a dungeon map on the UI permanently from the get-go. Not sure why there isn't a world map when outside of dungeons and specifically on the overworld, but who am I to complain? This right here makes the Ages port of classic Phantasy Star the definitive one in my book, as it functions just like the Atlas, having you make a dungeon's map as you go, but never disappearing unless you yourself turn it off. Along with this map having more details, with them notifying the player on hidden passages and floor trap locations, these made exploring dungeons miles better than otherwise, even if I'm still not crazy about them. I understand that the maze-like layouts themselves are the puzzle and ultimately the challenge of these locales, but this approach toward dungeon design just isn't for me. I hesitate to say that I dislike them outright, but they're probably some of the weaker parts of the gameplay experience for me, and played the smallest role in helping me forge my own journey throughout the game's design choices. Something that almost everything else did to a greater degree, including the battle system, which I believe it's about time we cover. The game features your traditional turn-based combat controlling up to the 4-character party. You've got normal attacks, magic, the option to talk to an enemy, use items, like the video, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications, or just run away. Talking may have sounded interesting, but it's really just Nothing. When you find enemies who speak your language or get an item that allows you to talk with enemies that don't, they say a line of dialogue and then just dip. It's simply a more reliable way to run from fights. After all, it's turn-based, so it can't guarantee that when you select the runaway option, you actually run away. Why? Hell if I know, every turn-based game does it and I hate it every time. Sorry, got a little carried away there. Anywho, everything else in combat is pretty run-of-the-mill. Your attack is either physical with a range of damage or fixed with the guns and such. Magic uses MP, items are items, yada yada yada. Although for some reason, you can't pick your specific target no matter if you use a standard item or magic. It's whatever your character decides to do at the moment, and I won't lie, this led to multiple frustrating moments and ruined potential strategies. I don't think it would have been beyond the system's power to be able to pick whatever enemy's ass I want to kick. To the shock of absolutely no one, the PS2 version does not have this issue. It does get rid of the ability to talk to enemies though. Oh no! Anyway, it adds a few more things to combat, so let's get into those. There's now an auto button, forcing everyone to just attack at will if you feel like you're capable or we're just gonna have everyone attack anyway. The ability to guard, which is always nice. A few extra spells for some characters, like a nice element for Meow and multi-targeting spells. And this version even introduces a whole new mechanic in the form of battle gems. These can be equipped to each character's weapon and allow said character to either use the elemental spell attached to the gem or the gem's supportive action. The real depth from these, however, comes from mixing and matching different ones, as characters can equip 2 gems at a time with specific combinations on specific characters, allowing for a third hidden spell, all of which either dealing big boy damage or providing big boy support, like, for example, the ability to revive a fallen ally. Even our boy Odin can cast spells with these, which was otherwise impossible, so it adds more options to the battle system. You love to see it. Here's the problem. The game doesn't tell you which matchups result in a special combination. This would incentivize experimentation, but the list of what 2 gems create a special combo is different for each character, meaning that, say, one combination on Alice isn't necessarily going to work on Meow. The amount of trial and error to figure out just what the heck works with one another is simply too much, and you might as well look up a spreadsheet like I did. Also, the gems stop working really quickly. They break after repeated use if you're lucky, but most of my gems would break after just one use of their combined spell. Admittedly, this does make some form of sense considering how ridiculously strong a lot of these combos are, especially the attacking ones, but this forced me to constantly run back to the one gem store in the entire game to keep restocking. I think it would have been better if we were to limit my special hidden spell to 1 use per battle instead of breaking the equipment altogether. That way we can balance the mechanic out without forcing me to burn through my money in order to keep taking advantage of it. And it would also encourage me to experiment more since I wouldn't have to constantly go back just to buy the ones I like. As it stands, it's a cool idea and an option I definitely relied on a lot later on, but it was unfortunately executed poorly. They did make battles more interesting though, in the PS2 version anyway, as both games' combat systems are pretty bare bones. Not to say I wasn't completely engaged, as some enemy combinations could catch me off guard, but I never found myself as invested as I would have liked. It doesn't help that turn-based combat is my least favorite out of all the RPG battle systems, so it already takes a bit to get my attention, and this game did not do that. Bosses were pretty uninteresting as well. The first one was kinda cool, having the boss constantly apply poison so the status effect acted as a dynamic timer for added challenge, but the rest were just damage walls. Buff your team, hit the guy, heal your party, rinse and repeat. So yes, this is an area where I acknowledge the game's age catching up with it, being dated in a sense. It's an area in the remake where I wouldn't have minded if it took more creative liberties to make it all more interesting beyond just the gems, but all of that being said, above all, who am I kidding? I still liked it because it acted as yet another instance where the game allows the player to forge their own experience through the ways it's designed. In fact, this was the game's feature that made the whole of Phantasy Star click with me in the first place. It was during one of my grind sessions in the PS2 version. I was just kind of chilling, hanging out with some peeps in my Discord server and relaxing with the game I was really digging. I didn't have to put too much thought into my every action. I found a pattern that worked with the enemies I was grinding off of and stuck to it. But I still got that dopamine from seeing my character's numbers grow. I still enjoyed the fact that my characters were getting stronger. I wasn't necessarily getting any better at the game. I mean, not like there were a lot of mechanics that allowed for this, but I didn't really care. It was just cool seeing growth, if not on my end, then on my parties. And that in and of itself somehow ended up being enough to get me attached to this group. I was seeing these characters grow not in a narrative sense, but a gameplay one. And since this is, well, a video game that allowed for emotional attachment unlike that of what I'm used to. Odin may not have been too prevalent in story cutscenes, but after my playthrough, playthrough, he stayed on my mind, being remembered as my hardest hitter, and a guy that got me out of a lot of tough spots over the course of many battles and boss fights. The guy whose strength I always buff first in the ladder especially. Alice isn't just a badass character with cool moments every now and then, she was my most reliable party member who only fell in battle a handful of times. Those last two bosses gave me a lot of trouble in the original, but each time when my team fell, she remained standing and got the finishing blow on both. MVP of both of my playthroughs without question. Whenever she struggled, that was my indication that I just wasn't a high enough level or maybe messed up somewhere along the line. These characters were ones I grew closer to thanks to the gameplay and this battle system rather than any shining moments in the story. And contrary to what I'm used to, this worked. In fact, it resembled a feeling I got when falling in love with the cast of my favorite game, forging a relationship with them primarily through a combat system where everyone has a role and feels unique. Granted, in said best game ever, they're also just good characters in a narrative sense, but the combat connection was an important factor in establishing them as my favorite cast of all time, and this plays the biggest role in making Phantasy Star's ragtag group pretty special to me, and making the overall journey I took in Phantasy Star special and my very own. How it still works in my eyes. Everything from the freedom of exploration, open-ended character relationships, and its simplistic combat system paved the way for the player to use their imagination and forge their own journey through the fleshed out worlds provided to them. And it's not like I'm excusing every design choice here, because I'm not. Things like the music, dungeon design, and boss battles still bother me and prevent me from calling this some kind of misunderstood masterpiece. I don't think it is one. But I do recognize that it has merits unique to classic RPGs, and that it doesn't have to follow every rule of what modern RPGs seemingly have to in order to be any good. This ability to craft and experience all your own as a result of the game working around its classic limitations is the root of its retro appeal, and many of these lines of thinking can be applied to other games of this style. And both versions of the game I played are what I believe to be the best ways to experience these titles and help alleviate some of the bigger issues like cryptic progression, labyrinthian dungeons, and an incredibly bare-bones combat system. So for those of you who've been keeping track of the data design checklist, no, I don't care that I have a limited inventory. I'm actually encouraged not to hoard items and use them when appropriate. I don't care that I have to grind every now and then. It can be sort of relaxing. And no, I don't care that I don't always know where to go, because sometimes I need to get out of my comfort zone and just explore, because there are a ton of ways to reach the end of the game. The map is designed in a way that encourages exploration with a minimal amount of empty space due to its density, so just going off on your own and seeing what you can find is really no big deal. The game pushed me out of my comfort zone and opened my mind to enjoying these types of games in a way I didn't think possible. So while it shouldn't make any sense, somehow, some way, I ended up loving Phantasy Star, and it came from a very genuine place. Now, would I recommend this game to anyone? It's complicated. I want to make it clear that none of these apologetic statements invalidates any of the criticism I've laid out, and with the original especially, it can be hard to get through no matter what you do. But I did, and you know what? I'd probably do it again. A lot of this game can easily be seen as unacceptable with the kind of market we have these days and the plethora of options that offer more conveniences to players and whatnot, but I truly believe that there's merit in putting your biases and expectations aside for games on a case-by-case basis and allowing yourself to grow accustomed to what it expects out of the player, rather than remaining stagnant and only playing games that reach whatever criteria you have for what makes a good game a good game. In other words, it's a great feeling to naturally enjoy a game that clicks with what you want, but choosing to like a game, trying to like a game, can oftentimes lead to a feeling just as great, if not greater. I understand that this is a big ask with how saturated the medium is and with all these options available at your disposal, but it's okay to slow down and truly digest the many works of art that make said medium up. And sometimes that requires you to put in a little more work, but more often than not, it's worth the effort. In this case, it was for me, as after years of putting many super old RPGs off in favor of newer ones, after finally trying to enjoy one and put my biases and expectations aside, I found a new game to love and was introduced to a whole new series and its stories it wants to tell. I could very easily have missed this. So even though I'm not really trying to sell anyone on this game, you can do whatever you want, I don't really care. I hope my words stuck with you and that you keep this all in mind. And if you are intrigued, I don't think you can go wrong with either version I played. Both of them excel in different areas. The original is non-linear, replayable, and easy to pick up and run through, especially thanks to all the additions and quality of life features M2 brought for this definitive Switch port. The PS2 version has a lot more substance to its battle system, looks prettier, and adds more depth to the story and characters. Both games give the same core experience, so whichever one interests you the most is the one you should go for, but if I had to pick my personal preference, it would actually be the original. Again, Can't emphasize this enough, the Switch Sega Ages port is so good and super cheap. Whenever I come back to this game, it'll most definitely be through this version. Don't be afraid to give it a shot. If you don't like it, it'll only set you back like $8. Good heavens. In the end, Phantasy Star is an interesting first step into the RPG genre for Sega. It's fairly dated and has a lot of strange design choices, but it's all preceded by a truly creative experience that allows freedom in how the player traverses its world and takes on its challenges. The blend of fantasy and sci-fi elements gives the game an identity all its own, and due to its focused cast, one way or another, you may find yourself getting attached. It's a tough game to recommend, but like I said, I'm not really trying to sell you all on this game. I just wanted to put into words how and why it not only clicked with me, but made me appreciate retro RPGs. Honestly, after playing this game, I see them in a whole new light. Like I found something totally new to get excited for in this medium. How can I not make a video talking about the game that kicked it all off? However you choose to look at this game differently or not, whether you choose to try it or not, I just hope my adoration of the game was clearly conveyed, because despite everything, despite the admittedly frustrating sections, learning curves, and solutions to problems most modern games don't even have anymore, I chose to love this game. I tried to love this game. I learned to love this game. And when it was all said and done, those feelings became genuine, real, and completely natural. Truly a fitting start to Sega's RPG legacy. As always, a big thank you to both Nio and Sol for the excellent work on the thumbnail. Both of their Twitter accounts are linked in the description below, so give them a follow and commission if you want some quality work. Nio for the art and Sol for the graphic design. Big thanks to my patrons, specifically the $10 Mystic artists, who go by the names of First Lieutenant Noguchi, Capone of the Lane, Colin Dre, Flora Grar, Kiara Loveday, Becca Saltman, Neolab, Noah Ignis, and Upscale Wife 417. With much love and a kiss on the cheek also going to all of my base and burst artists listed here. All of you guys' support is appreciated and I'm consistently grateful for it. Thank you all so much. Thank you for just watching the video. Please give it a like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed it. And however you choose to support me or not, so long as you stay hydrated, I will see you in whatever we do next.